Konnichiwa. Welcome to this presentation. My name is Vignesh and I will be talking about the DaVinci Configurator Pro option CI. Okay, let's get started. So the agenda for today's presentation, we'll start with an introduction, look at a typical classic Microsoft project and see, okay, who are the people involved in this project and what do they do and what tools they use to achieve the activities. And then talk about continuous integration. What is it? Why do we need it? And how Option CI helps to achieve this concept. And finally, we look at different integration use cases and take one of those and use it as an example to see what will be the impact on different people in the project while using Option CI and also while not using Option CI. So you can see what are the differences that are there in the activities they perform and what benefit they get out of it. So here in a typical classic Microsoft project, it normally starts with a system architect. And here the system architect will develop the vehicle architecture using prevision. And an extract on an ECU level is then provided to the application developer to further develop the software components within the ECU. And for this, they use the DaVinci Developer toolchain. And then you have the integrator who will integrate the changes done by the application developer onto the basic software. And the basic software is configured using DaVinci Configurator Pro. And the integration is also done using DaVinci Configurator Pro and can be done together with Virtual Target in cases when you are in an early stage of the project. So Virtual Target Basic can provide you the functionality of a target hardware, and Virtual Target Pro can provide you the emulation of both the target hardware as well as the basic software. And then finally, you have the tester who uses Canoe to both develop and test the application software. So this is a typical classic Microsoft toolchain and the different people involved in this project. And today, the focus of this presentation will be on ECU integration, and we'll focus on these two members in the project, the application developer and the integrator, and to see how the application integration can be automated using Option CI. So just to give you a brief overview of the DaVinci Developer and the Configurator, we'll start with the DaVinci Developer. The DaVinci Developer tool is used by the application developer to define software components and also to define the connection between the software components. It's also possible to group the different software components is what is called as a software composition. And finally, it's also possible to export the software composition into an ARXML file. And this ARXML file can also be later on used when we talk about as an input to the Option CI plugin. The DaVinci Configurator Pro is the tool that is used for configuring the basic software modules. And it's also used to do the integration of the software components on top of the basic software and generate the runtime environment. So why do we need to automate the integration process? So in the traditional development, when there is no Option CI applied, we can look at an example here. So if I am the application developer and I'm working on the feature 1, and I have made some changes in the software model using DaVinci Developer and maybe also some code changes using another IDE like MATLAB. And then I want to know two things. That is, one, if the integration will be successful with the new changes made in the model. And second, if the logic or the changes I have made in my implementation is going to satisfy requirements. And to answer these two questions, I need to wait for the scheduled integration that is planned at the end of the sprint. And a sprint, as you know, may last somewhere between 2 weeks to 4 weeks. So I may very well have to wait for another 2 weeks or so before I can test the result of my changes. And this long overall duration of the sprint is the main problem that we are trying to solve by automating the integration process. Because when you have a long overall duration, you also have a delayed verification of your software changes, thereby making it even more difficult when you have to rework the implementation or the software model. And finally, also when the integration happens, the integrator is not an expert on the application software. The integrator knows the system well, he knows the ECU configuration, but maybe not the internal details of every single software component. And this will also result in discussions to be done between the integrator and the application developer before they can finalize on an integration that can be used. So the integrator is the bottleneck for software developers. And this is the problem we are trying to solve with Option CI. So what is Option CI then? What do we do? So Option CI, we try to front load the decisions that are made by the application developer and allow the application developer to make these decisions already when he's made his changes both in the model or on the implementation level. And using this automatic integration, he can already then immediately check the result of his changes and also check that the integration will be successful or not. And this can be done both on a local PC, or when you have a CI toolchain, then you can do a central execution of the integration. So this thereby reduces the waiting time for the software developer considerably to know the result of the integration and also to know the result of the verification of the software changes they have made. So there are different ways to automate the integration process. So Option CI, of course, is one solution, but you may know that we also have another option called the Option Workflow or Option WF. So what are the differences between Option Workflow and Option CI? When do you have to use Option Workflow, and when do you use Option CI? So simply put, Option Workflow is basically a development environment that can be used by the customer to develop scripts for the modification of the input system descriptions, which is your ARXML files, for example, and also for the automation of the DaVinci configurator. So as we said, you can modify data because you have access to the complete AutoSum model. You can modify the ECUC or the ECU configuration. You can trigger code generation. You can also handle the project file, which means you can use, for example, Canoe. You can trigger Canoe to do a test automation. And finally, the same IDE that you get with Option WF can also be used to debug the scripts that you have developed. And it's also important to note that a license is not required for the actual execution of the scripts, but more needed for the person who develops the scripts and debugs the scripts. In comparison, Option CI is a standard solution from Vector, which is used for the specific purpose of automated integration. So what you do here is basically the modification of the ECU configuration based on the application developer's software changes. And by giving you a standard solution, it's helpful for the customer because you will now save time and effort by not having to write your own scripts and having to maintain them in the long run. But what's also interesting, since Option CI focuses mainly on integration or not on the other activities that I mentioned above, you could use both Option WF and Option CI together to automate different parts of the development cycle. So finally, what do you get when you get Option CI as a delivery? What is the delivery containing? So Option CI contains two plugins. One is a Gradle plugin, which is going to be used as a build management tool. And then you have the DaVinci Configurator Pro 5 plugin. So the Gradle plugin basically helps to call the configurator plugin to achieve different automated tasks. And the DaVinci Configurator plugin provides different functionality. For example, you have task mapping, data mapping, and port mapping, which can be done via integration instructions in a text file. And then you have integration on virtual target or real target. And then finally, you also have a report generation. So you can get a report to see what changes have been done in the configuration at various stages of the integration process. So this will be helpful for you when you want to debug and go back and check where the configuration went wrong. So what is Gradle? So Gradle is a flexible and a powerful build tool. It's an open source software. And if you want to compare it with what you're using today in your existing integration process, it's something like GNU Make. So you probably use a Make system today to build your software, and Gradle is more a replacement to that. So what does the workflow look like when you want to use Option CI? So here, from an application developer point of view, you will work on the app, what we call as an app package. So an app package basically contains of three elements. You have the software component. It can also be a software composition. It depends on how you split the different application software components in your project. If you have more developers working on the same composition, then it's going to be a little bit harder for you to merge the changes made by them. So it's recommended that you split the number of components into the best way that works for your team so that you can work independently from each other. So it contains the software component, which is your ARXML export from the DaVinci Developer. Then you have your implementation. So this could be either C code or an object library. And then you have the integration instructions. So this is what is the main input to Option CI to automate the integration. So here you will mention what is the runnable to task mapping, what are the ports that are to be mapped, and what are the data elements that need to be mapped. And from an integrator point of view, they will provide what is called as a root configuration. So here you have a configured basic software. Option CI at the moment does not automatically configure your basic software. So that is still to be done manually. So once the integrator has configured the basic software without any apps and RTE, he is able to provide this as an input to all the application developers to use as a base onto which they can integrate their application changes using Option CI. And when you have both of these inputs, Option CI can automate the integration process and provide an integration result where you get an app-dependent basic software configuration. So now let's take a look at a couple of integration use cases where Option CI can be used. And then we can take one of them and look at it in more detail for a comparison of how the workflow would look like for both the application developer and the integrator when not using Option CI, and then what they will do when they use Option CI. On this slide, I have listed a couple of integration use cases where Option CI can be used. The first one is when an application developer has made changes to the software component model using DaVinci Developer and would like to test if the integration is successful and also get an executable software instantly. The second one is when an application developer has made changes to the implementation. So they have changed the source code or library that is used, the software component, and want to test the software instantly. Third, you have from an integrator perspective, when the integrator is updating the root configuration. If you remember from the earlier slide, we spoke about the root configuration being the basic configuration for the BSW modules without any applications, which is used by the application developer to do the integration. So when the integrator makes any change to the root configuration, it could be due to either a new communication matrix or a new diagnostics database. So once he has updated the root configuration, he would like to test and see together with the software components if the integration is successful or are there any problems. And finally, for those customers who are a software provider, a tier 2 company, if you will. So here the application developer would like to test the software, but does not have all the complete information. So this could be, for example, missing task names or missing software components within the composition. So maybe the application developer has not received all the parts of the ECU in order to test the software. So here Option CI can also help. Option CI does have features like software for missing software compositions and for also missing init data, for example, where we are still able to provide an executable software even beyond the missing information to test. So we will take a look at only the first use case, which is the application developer wants to test the software model and get executable software instances. So we will take a look at this use case and do a comparison of what would be the activities performed by the application developer and the integrator. We will take a look first at without using Option CI, and then the next slide afterwards we'll look at with Option CI. So in the traditional model, we will start with the application developer making changes to the software component model. So this could be changes in port connections or data elements, and that is done using the DaVinci Developer tool. If the application developer wants to make any changes when it comes to runnable or task mapping, in the traditional model, it's not possible to do it in this phase. So then they could also have changes in the implementation, and finally they have to wait for the integrator to do the integration to test the changes. So from an integrator point of view, they will perform the schedule integration, and this will also include runnable to task mapping, and then they will generate RTE and the basic software. And this is done using the DaVinci Configurator Pro, including option RTE when you want to generate the RTE. So this will be the typical use case, and when there are any issues with the integration, the integrator and the application developer will debug together to solve the problems in the integration. Now if we look at the same use case where the application developer has made changes to the software model, but then we do it together with Option CI. So here the first step would be with the integrator providing what we call as the root configuration. So the basic software module is configured, and also any updates made to the communication metrics or updates to the diagnostic database. And then you have the application developer. Once he has received the root configuration from the integrator, he or she can make any updates to the software model, provide integration instructions, which is done as a text file. So it looks something like this. It's a JSON file, which is much easier to edit than having to open the configurator model when you're not aware about the system level configuration. So you can provide both runnable to task mapping, port connections, as well as data element mapping, all of them in separate integration instruction files. And then the application developer can perform integration on their own by using the DaVinci Configurator Pro and Option CI without having to wait for the integrator. So then you may wonder, okay, now that the integration is performed by the application developer, what else does the integrator have to do beyond providing updates to the root configuration? Well, the integrator can also act as a supervisor. So the integrator can provide what we call as global integration instructions. So these are common integration instructions that they can provide in a global file, which will be applicable for all software components and all application developers. And this will have precedence over the instructions given by the application developer so that the integrator still has control over the integration process. And also, as in the previous traditional model, he can still help out with any problems with the integration. So this will be the changes for the different rows from the traditional model to integration with Option CI. So how does it look when we use Option CI in a continuous integration pipeline? So here we have a CI pipeline. So you could have, for example, an application developer, integrator, and as we discussed a couple of times now, the application developer will work with IDE and DaVinci Developer, and the integrator provides the basic software configuration, what we call as root configuration. And when there are changes made by the application developer in either the software model or in the implementation, the CI toolchain will automatically be triggered and will start with an input validation. So here the CI toolchain will trigger DaVinci Developer to verify that the AR.XML files that are provided are in fact valid. And when that is passed, it will move on to update the configuration using DaVinci Configurator Pro. And then finally, it will generate the build and also can test the integration if required on virtual target, which is optional. If you are not using virtual target, basic or pro, then you could still use a build together with a valid compile license to generate an executable file for the real target and be tested. So this complete pipeline that you see here is executed by the option CI plugin. So this will be an end to my presentation. Thank you.